Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Great. So hello, everyone. My name is Kristen Dreiling, and I am the Capacity Building and Learning Lead on the Atlas Project. Thank you so much for joining us on what is kind of an exciting day and a little bit bittersweet. This is the last adaptation community meeting that the Atlas Project and our team here at Chemonics will be hosting in kind of the traditional sense. So thank you all for joining and for those joining us online. As many of you know, the Atlas Project is coming to a close with most of our technical work wrapping up at the end of December in 2019. So the November adaptation community meeting, or I guess the November traditional ACM date, will actually be an Atlas final event wherein we'll be focusing on Atlas's contributions that the project has made to the adaptation community space in advancing adaptation and resilience objectives, and also hosting a larger conversation of where we go from here and how we hope our work contributes to ongoing programming into the future. So there's more details to come on that. But I do want to take this opportunity to say on behalf of the Atlas team, thank you to all of those who have participated in these events, all of those who have presented in these events. This series and the adaptation community meetings were really always intended to be a forum to bring together practitioners to discuss challenges, solutions, present on innovative topics and emerging trends, and this has really been an exciting time to have these discussions. And so thank you to all those who have participated in these, and we really hope to work with USAID to find a way to continue this series going forward. So we hope this is not goodbye forever, but a bit of a pause perhaps until next year. So again, thank you to everybody. Before we get into the main event, a couple of reminders. If you have not signed up on climatelinks.org for reminders of events and great resources, please do so. We have a sign-up sheet in the back. And for any of the folks joining us via phone, if you can please be sure to mute your mics. We would appreciate that. Okay. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker. So Andre Mershon is joining us here to present USAID's approach to developing and managing shock-responsive programming and adaptive mechanisms. So we're excited to have him here today. Andre is a resilience advisor with USAID Center for Resilience in the Bureau of Food Security, where he supports a portfolio of resilience investments across 13 countries, including strategy and program design. And he was previously a climate change specialist in the USAID Global Climate Change Office, where he worked on adaptation, gender, and training. So please join me in welcoming Andre, and I'll turn it over to him.
Okay, you let me know if I'm okay. Yeah, this is kind of fun. It's a little bit coming full circle for me. I think as many as you know, I was the first COR on the Atlas project. What was it, about 4 years ago now, Chris? So it's interesting to see kind of that wave of programming come to an end and to see all of the very interesting things that have been done. I think it's great, too, to have some familiar faces in the room. I know a lot of us have been working on these challenges for a long time. They morph, they change, but the need to be flexible, the need to be adaptable, and the need to change with the times doesn't. And so that's a little bit what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to take advantage of kind of having everyone here to talk a little bit about resilience at USAID. I know some of you are extremely familiar with this topic and have heard a lot on this already, but I think for some of you who've been focused a little bit more on kind of the climate angle, I think it's interesting to see kind of the direction that USAID is taking and where these things kind of overlap and intersect and maybe where they don't. I'm going to talk a little bit about shock responsive programming, kind of what we mean by that, as well as kind of what that means in terms of how we might think about program design. I'm going to talk about what it means for USAID partners. I know most of you in the room are USAID partners. You work for a USAID partner. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I hope it means for some changes at the agency. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some places that we're seeing this pop up in procurement language and RFAs and RFPs, and some examples from our programs in the Sahel that I happen to know really well. But I was in Dakar for 2 months this summer working at our Sahel regional office on our RISE program, our Resilience in the Sahel Enhanced program. So it's one that I'm really familiar with. I realize I've been working on it for 7 years now, and I have a lot of interest in that and a lot of thoughts on kind of what we're doing in a very difficult situation there. So let me talk a little bit about kind of the resilience background. This is the definition. Yes, USAID does have a formal definition of resilience. This is from our 2012 policy. And we're really looking at the ability of people, households, communities, countries, and systems. So that's working at a whole lot of different levels, mitigate and adapt and recover from shocks and stresses. And of course, that does include shocks and stresses, but as I'll talk about in a minute, climate shocks and stresses, it's not exclusive to climate shocks and stresses. There's a wider lens on it. There's a more, kind of succinct definition here. We have a nice video. I think it doesn't work so well in this kind of technological format, but if you're interested in seeing our intro 2-minute teaser video, or you want to explain to your colleagues what resilience at USAID is, the link is up there for you. And I think one of the things that we can kind of all agree on is shock responsiveness, being able to respond to these recurrent shocks and being able to manage adaptively is, of course, essential for resilience. And I know a lot of you in this room have been working on those topics. Let me talk a little bit more of the background. I think most of you have seen this as well, but why we're investing in building resilience to recurrent crisis, especially in places where it results in large-scale repeat humanitarian emergencies. The numbers there tell the story. And it's not just the dollar numbers, but there are my boss, Greg Collins, who's the director for resilience at USAID. He talks a lot about, now at DAA, he talks a lot about the personal toll of 250,000, mostly children, dying in the Horn drought in 2011 in Somalia, and that being something that's really kind of a motivating factor for him. I've spent a lot of time working in the Sahel, and so working in that area is a motivating factor for me as well. I think most people who are in the resilience and climate change space obviously understand the value of making investments ahead of time and trying to reduce risk and not spending as much time and money and effort fixing problems after the fact. So in terms of kind of where we're focused, I mentioned we're focused on places where we have a recurrent crisis that is resulting in large-scale repeat humanitarian emergencies. We have a set of countries here that we've largely worked on through one program cycle. We started working in Kenya and the Horn in 2011, in Niger and Burkina Faso in 2012, 2013, and in Mali around that same time. So we've kind of run one program cycle. We had a nice event at the Real Award led by Save the Children with Tango and Mercy Corps put on a month or so ago, giving the results of the full kind of evaluation cycle that had been gone through for the PREG partnership, which is our resilience program in northern Kenya, as well as the PRIME activity in Ethiopia. So these are programs that have kind of been with us since the beginning, if you will, of resilience. You saw the date on the policy was 2012. And then we have kind of these newly designated countries, some of which we've had work with in the past, but some of which are really relatively new to kind of how we look at resilience at USAID. It's not to say that the problems are new, they're long-standing. I think you'll see that there is nothing on this list that looks easy. It certainly doesn't look easy to me. And part of what we want to get at is that a lot of where we need to work more and more is not easy places. And one of the stats that kind of grabs my eye and grabs the eye of a lot of people is that 10 or 15 years ago we were spending about 80% of our humanitarian assistance responding to natural disasters, which is kind of what we traditionally think we do in humanitarian assistance, and about 20% responding to kind of conflict, and we'll call them man-made disasters for lack of a better term. That's been flipped in recent years, and we're putting more and more and more money into places where, yes, there's natural disasters. It's compounded with political risk, instability, climate variability, very complicated risk environments, but where conflict and instability play a huge role in what we do. And I think this has really led to kind of a shift in thinking, both in strategy, and that's kind of what we're talking about in this level, kind of where we're investing, how we're investing, and also in tactics in terms of the types of things that we're investing and the way that we're looking at our programming. And again, I think some of you have been very much on the ground of some of those challenges. So what's different about resilience and what's not? Resilience is not everything. It's not in many ways different, but in some ways it is, and it's important to kind of point them out. One is this focus on people, places, and subject to recurrent crisis. I think many of you might remember kind of the first iteration of Feed the Future, where we were only going to work in highly productive zones of places. So we were only going to work in the highlands of Ethiopia and Kenya and those places which are a nice place to work and have great economic potential. But when we look at where our humanitarian assistance goes and where we see all sorts of kind of enduring problems, it tends not to be in those places always that are better off. And so there's been a real focus on places like northern Kenya, like southern and eastern Ethiopia, like the Karamoja region of Uganda, like parts of Mali and Niger and Burkina Faso, where we have these kind of recurrent problem sets. I think the other thing is changing the mandate a little bit from treating shocks and stresses as kind of something that's an anomaly. I think this has been a challenge in USAID programming, and we don't always treat this consistently. I remember reading a CDCS a few years ago where one DO was related to kind of the development side, and it said, when it's where the FTF, the pure FTF ag value chains programming was going to sit, and it said, we don't anticipate there will be a drought during the 5-year course of programming. And then the other DO, which was more of the resilience and some of the other food for peace type programming, said, we anticipate there will definitely be a drought during the 5 years of programming. So part of it is kind of understanding what our assumptions are and changing the default assumption from something won't happen to something probably will happen. What do we think it is? What are we going to do about it? How are we going to prepare for it? How are we going to respond to it? That's really a lot of what the shock responsive development is about. Also, it's about early response, and that's a tricky thing because we have a lot of programs already on the ground, and often they are kind of on the front lines of when something happens, and they will remain on the front lines, but we also kind of have this whole humanitarian assistance apparatus, both from USAID and from other donors and other actors. And it sounds really nice in theory that those things are all going to work better together in terms of planning, in terms of execution. It's really actually quite complicated in practice, and it's something we're going to talk about a little bit more. I think the other thing that's very important from kind of, especially from the partner perspective, is thinking about this kind of joint analysis, planning, and implementation across sectors. And when I first came to AID, the usual mandate, at least for me, was you work in a technical office, you have this kind of funding, go out and design a program using this type of funding, and it was considered innovative if it used one or two other types of funding as part of the design, and then go out and make sure that that the program is technically sound, they're meeting all the indicators for that particular funding stream. We have traditionally tended to design around what types of resources we have as opposed to what types of problems we have. And one of the things that I've always loved about resilience was that we have designed around problem sets first, and then we have gone and looked for the resources that we need. That doesn't make it easy because no single resource stream at AID or no single technical sector can do everything that we need. And each of them has their ways of doing things, and each of them has their contribution to make. And bringing all these things together is not easy. I mean, you can see this is from, I think, the first round of some of the programs in Kenya where we had about 10 different funding streams kind of all pulling in the same direction across different activities, different mechanisms. So that's a huge challenge. It's a huge lift in aid land to make that happen. I think the last piece is focusing on capacity, not just vulnerability, thinking about some of the intangible factors, or what we sometimes consider to be the intangible factors, not just how many of X did we build, but how do people really feel about their ability to kind of take care of themselves and to be able to respond to shocks. And many of the things that we kind of take for granted that we don't always see in communities that are beset by poverty, whether it be domestically or abroad. So I want to talk really quickly, because I know this is the adaptation community meeting, so we want to talk a little bit about adaptation. I want to talk a little bit, and I put it as verses. That's probably not a fair thing to do. These things are very closely aligned, but I did want to point out a couple places where there are some differences. So resilience is really looking at a very broad set of risks. Greg Collins says we don't look at risk one slice at a time, and that's really kind of what resilience is about. So obviously that includes climate risk, and most of the places you can see that we have the big resilience portfolios, they are there because the predominant risk is a recurrent climate risk of some nature. There is a recurrent drought problem. In some cases, it's combined with flooding or storms or things of that nature, and recurrent climate risks are a fact of life in those areas. But resilience also looks at the complex and compound nature of risk. So it's looking at these things in context and understanding how these different risks kind of feed off each other, and also how different responses to that might need to be looked at a little bit more holistically, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So obviously you have a climate risk management process. That's both internally, but that's something that you guys are being asked to do in your work as well. It's a great chance to screen for some of those risks, and it's a great chance to think systematically about what kind of risks might be an issue for us. And I don't think it's an accident that many of the people that work on resilience come from the climate world. We tend to be broad thinkers by nature, and we tend to be looking across sectors because climate is kind of everything's your business in the climate world. And so I think a lot of that thinking has been carried over to resilience as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about shock responsive development and kind of why we do it. I think we alluded to some of that already. Obviously, shocks are perennial features of the places. You saw the list of places where we're working. Speed matters in a crisis. One of the impetuses for putting this guidance together was going to the Ethiopia mission in 2016 and sitting down with their program office and some of their technical folks and having them tell me that in the midst of the worst drought, basically in 50 years, in terms of agro-climatology, in terms of rainfall, that they were waiting 6 weeks to get JREs from Washington. That's a justification to restrict eligibility so you can give more money to your partner that's already on the ground in the midst of this crisis, and it was slowing down their response in terms of using their existing development partners on the ground to either change what they were doing or to move to different regions where the situation was worse. Those things were slowing down the response at a critical time, and that's really one of the things that drives this work. What is it? I mean, really, we want to be able to deploy a wide range of humanitarian and development assets. That sounds great in theory. It's really hard to do in practice, and for reasons that become clearer and clearer to me every day. But it's also an adaptive approach. It's being able to proactively anticipate, plan, build in that flexibility. And I think as many of you have worked with USAID before or other donors, you get halfway into something and you say, gosh, I really wish we could do X. And it wasn't written that way whenever somebody wrote it 3 years or 4 years or 5 years or whatever, however long ago said thing was designed. And so what we're trying to do is to have people be a little bit more forward thinking and try and build in some of that flexibility from the front. And obviously you heard a lot about adaptive management. If you see any of the stuff that changes in the ADS 201, the stuff that PPL talks about, this is all part of the same thing. And you would want an adaptive management approach even if you weren't working in a shock-prone environment. That's good development, et cetera. We're just noting that this is particular to some of these places where we know we have these risks and we're programming in those areas. So I want to talk a little bit about this guidance, and this is the first time I've actually presented this outside of USAID, and I've presented it probably a dozen times inside USAID. OAA runs a training on adaptive management, of which there's a module that, and I usually come and give an hour on talking about this guidance and some examples, specifically language and things like that. So this is the first time this has been kind of shared outside of the agency. And to be honest, this guidance is really written for an internal audience. It is written for technical staff at missions who are making decisions about how to program, and it is designed also in conjunction with OAA so that it can be a tool for OAA staff, that's Office of Acquisitions and Assistance. There are contracting folks who ultimately make the decisions about what to award and sign the awards so that they can see kind of what kind of flexibilities we have. That is the target audience here. So if you read this document and you say, well, I'm not quite sure how this applies to me, there's kind of sort of a reason to that. That said, we want to be transparent. We want everybody thinking about these things and not just kind of internally. We need partners to think about these things. At the end of the day, we can write the best thing we want on paper. If we don't have buy-in on that vision, if we don't have the ability to do that vision collectively, it doesn't matter how good our design was. So part of what we want to do is we want to be transparent. We want to show you guys what we're working on. And this is a kind of a constant complaint that comes up when you talk to partners over the years. Well, we don't have enough flexibility. So it's to say we are working on it, and we are trying to do better. What this is designed to do is to really kind of give give aid staff kind of a set of options, and a lot of them are kind of contracting or assistance options. So it's both types of mechanisms that you might use, and you can see that they're kind of detailed in there, as well as approaches you might use within those mechanisms. And I'll talk a couple of examples here in a minute when you need more flexibility. And it's kind of agnostic as to, it's not saying you should definitely use this approach or that approach. What it is noting these are all the approaches that kind of exist in this realm, maybe not all of them, but most of them, a good set of them. And here are some of the options, and here are some of the pros and cons for you to think about as an aid person when you're trying to figure out kind of how and what to do. It is not procurement reform. All of this is within the existing rules and regs. There's a whole other procurement reform process that's been going on kind of separately at the agency. I know there were a lot of partners that were consulted on that. I think it was in late 2018, and I hope there will be something more publicly on that for everybody. But I don't have anything else to say on that. As I mentioned, it's also written for our OAA staff, for our people that really pay attention to contracts and grants and sign these things and run some of our really big programs. And a lot of the people that we've done training with that's led by OAA actually are COs and AOs, which is great because we need their buy-in as well. This is not just a technical issue. This is an issue of how the agency runs contracts and grants. So this is the tools that are here in terms of kind of identifying mechanisms, checking the language in your award. As an implementer, you're definitely first thing you're going to do is check the language in your RFA or RFP and find out what's in there and what kind of flexibility that gives you and what you can do with it. Looking at things like the change clause. If you're already in an award, is it a place where you might want to modify that award? And so that's kind of if you were already kind of in a project cycle, but if you're at the beginning of a project cycle, and that's usually when we try and definitely intervene and point things in certain directions, it's questions of how you might build it into a new award. And then not just how it would be applied at one level, but how you might think about it at all levels. Because, you know, at AID, we're going to have a CDCS. We're usually going to have a PAD, a project appraisal document, which kind of governs a sectoral approach. Sometimes it's across sectors, which is great when we can get it. Sometimes it's around a resilience development objective, which is even better. And then, you know, we'll have activity design, and then as you well know, activity design is great, but if it doesn't make it down into the work plans and it doesn't make it down into the implementation, then you're not really want out of it. These are just a couple of examples I put in here just to kind of give you guys some illustrations of things that are in there as techniques that aid staff can use. And this is obviously too where partners would come into the equation quite a bit. You know, in terms of things like using a flexible or living work plan where you don't necessarily say, okay, well, we're going to know everything in September, and that's definitely going to guide everything we're going to do until the following September. I think most of us that have worked in management on either side of this equation know that we do some version of that anyway. But it's just to say that there are ways to kind of formalize that within the process or be a little less restrictive about it. And that may be very relevant in places where the situation is changing on a regular basis and you need to be adaptable and flexible. Another one is phased implementation, where you're doing a certain piece of your program, and then you are using the information that you collect from that and the knowledge that you've gained to kind of figure out what you want to do in the next phase. And there are different versions of this. You've probably seen some versions of this. There are examples that are cited in the document where an aid mission might use this again to kind of procure something initially, then work with a partner, and then really flesh out what we want to do going forward. So I want to talk a little bit, this is mostly partner audience, I want to talk about what this means for partners, at least what I hope it means. These are some changes that I hope will become wider spread at AID, and some ones that definitely we've been working on in the resilience realm. One is more demand for integrated shock responsive development work in complex risk environments. You saw that list of countries, and the resilience focus zones in those countries are in generally the toughest parts of those countries. So these are complex risk environments. But again, that is where the humanitarian assistance is going. That's where the challenges are perennially, and we want to invest in there long term to try and build that resilience if we can. But that requires us to do things that are often outside of kind of our traditional comfort zone. More emphasis and requirements for flexibility, adaptive management, et cetera, and I'll show some examples in a minute, including crisis modifiers. That's something that some of you may be familiar with in some of your programs. We're definitely trying some new stuff, as well as there's some stuff that, we'll keep doing. I think this is a complicated one, and it's a one from our perspective that is really important. It's been a little bit of a challenging one for partners, to be quite honest, and it's one where we need your feedback. It's this focus on collaborative programming and collective impact. At the end of the day, we're interested, especially in these resilience focus zones, in what is the collective impact of that set of programming, of that portfolio of programming, which includes the things that USAID is doing, but it also includes the things that USAID is not doing. But that could be multiple partners. I think in PREG, do you know how many they have in PREG, Karen? 33 partners in PREG. That's just USAID partners, right? That's just USAID partners in PREG. So that's our Partnership for Resilience and Economic Growth in northern Kenya. And we will have a lot of partners in our big programs in Niger and Burkina Faso too. So for us, that's really what's important. It's about putting together a portfolio of programs and activities across partners that is really going to help us deliver on building resilience. I realize that's complicated because that's not how we procure. We procure one activity, one mechanism at a time. And sometimes we try and procure a big mechanism that does many things. Sometimes we try and procure something that's more specialized. Program cycles aren't always synced up. Sometimes we have the best of intentions of awarding something by X date, and for whatever reason, it does not happen. And sometimes we have partners that jump at this, and sometimes we don't. And so this is a complicated thing to do. The other element to this is, we've been looking at it from kind of grand development design, but then you also in many of these environments have humanitarian partners that may be there for a long time. They may be there for a short time. They're usually on one-year funding cycles. So even if it's a long-term disaster of some nature, they're getting their funding renewed 1 year at a time, most of the time. And that may or may not work. We look at some places where we've been doing humanitarian assistance for 20 years in a row. And those are complicated situations. And so there's this question of, well, when does that become development assistance? But at the same time, there's this assumption that, well, we'll go from humanitarian assistance to development assistance, and it's a one-way street. But that street doesn't always run that way. And as we saw in Ethiopia in 2016, we needed a lot of humanitarian assistance in Ethiopia. Hundreds of millions of dollars of humanitarian assistance went into Ethiopia, even though we've been investing in kind of a lot of things over the long term. But at the same time, we did see some positive results in Ethiopia of communities that, with these multi-sectoral resilience programs have been able to more or less weather that shock and not kind of fall way down. So we are seeing some evidence on that as well. One thing that I hope we do a little bit more of is pre- and post-award co-creation processes. And I know co-creation is kind of it's a buzzword, it's a complicated topic, and there's a lot of different ways that we're doing this at AID. And I think we need to think very flexibly about this. These are complex environments to work in, and the usual approach is, you kind of sit down, you write an RFA or an RFP, you put it out, you get a proposal, and you look at your proposals, you choose a partner, and you hope for the best. And in many of the places that we're working, nobody knows what's going to happen 2 years from now. Nobody knows what that environment on the ground is going to look like 2 years from now. And so we need to be working with you. Some of you have experience working in those places. We look at a lot of our NGO partners. They've been in some of these difficult places for a long time. They have a lay of the land. And trying to understand kind of, all right, if we say we want you to do this, is that realistic? If we say we put this new fabulous flexibility clause in your award, is that going to work? I think from our perspective, too, doing stuff post-award, but pre-kind of signature of document or, apparently successful offer type thing, you can imagine from our perspective that gives us a lot of leverage, and it's a good thing for us to do before we kind of sign on the dotted line for things. So there's a lot of ways to kind of look at this, but it's something I hope we do more of, and it's something we are trying in certain places. I think if you look at the design process for RISE 2, we used RFIs pretty extensively to kind of signal to people what we plan to do, and also just get input on things that we were thinking of. And we often had workshops or at least Q&A sessions associated with those RFIs. This is also something that, as many of you know from the top, from the administrator, they want to see more of this, and for good reason. The other thing that I think is important too, and we have some of our resilience measurement colleagues in the room, including from Tango, who've been real leaders on this, we want to focus more on measuring changes in resilience at the household and systems level. We want to focus on people's resilience in response to shocks and less on counting things. Because part of the story we tell, and what's been really compelling in selling the resilience vision to the front office, to the Hill, is being able to say things like, in the midst of this horrible drought in Ethiopia, the households that were part of these multi-sectoral resilience programs were able to maintain their food insecurity while other households didn't. That's much more compelling a narrative than we built 68 wells or we trained 10,000 people or whatever counting thing we usually do. And this is more complicated again because activities are good at counting things. They're good at counting up trainings. You guys all have your indicators. Usually it's the number of something. And the number of something usually doesn't tell us fundamentally whether we've changed something in that environment or not, and whether we've actually built resilience. So we realize it's a complicated situation, but it's something that we're trying to evolve on. A couple of other thoughts we would like you to bring to the table when you're thinking about your side of program design. Nuanced understanding of these complex risk environments. These are complex environments. Many of the places we work in are complex environments. We want to know that you understand their complex environments, not just that they are, but why they are and how they are. We want you to be able to understand the lay of the land and show us that you understand that lay of the land, because you will be asked to work with all of these other players. It's not something that's nice to do. It's something that will be required, and we want to know that you can do that. One of the other things we talk about a lot is that a lot of big organizations tend to have experience across kind of the traditional humanitarian development divide. If we look at some of our big NGO partners, they usually have a humanitarian arm and a development arm. Sometimes they talk to each other, sometimes they don't, just like USAID. We really want to break down those silos to the extent possible. And I know some of the other organizations here have experience, for example, working with OTI, working on post-conflict, working on demobilization, all of these complicated situations, and all of that has something to bring to bear on some of these environments where we're working. And we want organizations with that expertise to not just say, well, we're going to do development over here and we're going to do all that other stuff over here, but to bring those two sides of the house together when you're thinking about your approaches and your programming. Think about your likely shocks, your contingency planning up front. We'll talk a little bit specifically about contingency planning. There's lots of ways to think about that. But what information do you need? What information do you have? What information do you need? Often there's this kind of amorphous kind of start to a project where we're going to go out and talk to some people. It's not always clear what information you need, why you couldn't get that information before you submitted a proposal from our perspective, what the value add is of sending a bunch of staff out to collect that information and what that's going to tell us. The other question, you guys think about all these things all the time. Do you need grant modalities? Do you need pre-authorized procurement? Are there other things that we need to set in motion so that when something does happen, we can respond more quickly and more effectively? Be realistic. If I had $1 for every proposal I read that had some startup time in it that was completely fictitious, I could run my own development program. And it's on us too. We expect things that aren't realistic, and the partners give us back things that aren't realistic. It's like we lie to each other and everyone says, yes, this is great, it's all going to be in 72 hours, and it never is. Almost never. It's not to say that, it's just to say that we need to be realistic about some of these things. Security protocols, staff security. I've worked a lot in the Sahel in recent years. These things are becoming a bigger and bigger issue. We have our experience in the OTI type programming. We have our experience in the humanitarian programming. But things about like, what kind of life insurance are you going to provide for your staff? These questions come up and they're important, and we want to keep people safe. And we all want to do that, and it's a tricky thing to do in these environments. And then the last one is talk to us. These are kind of shared challenges, especially, we're trying to have more interaction during the kind of the procurement phase, but then obviously afterwards, and having that dialogue, because these are not problems that we need each other to solve these problems, and we need other parts of these elements to solve these problems too. I'm going to talk very specifically about the program I've been working on in Niger and Burkina Faso. These are very shock-prone areas, not surprisingly. Our midterm assessment found that 96% of households in that area, in our zones, had experienced a shock in the last year. We've seen a lot more VEO activity, and there's always a likelihood of a drought impacting that zone at any given time. So we built this new RISE 2 program that's really focused on a targeted geography. It's this whole vision of multiple partners implementing collectively, and we're really focused on vulnerable populations. And this program has 5 DOs that stretch from basically kind of environment, land governance, to economic growth, ag programming, health programming across multiple different flavors, more pure governance programming, as well as gender and youth programming. So this really does a little bit of everything, and it's stretched across multiple different mechanisms. There's a RISE 2 technical working paper. If you Google RISE 2 technical working paper, it'll come up. That kind of lays out the whole vision for this thing. And it's big, but it's a big problem set. And the other thing is we're really vested in flexibility across mechanisms, and I'll talk about that in just a second. So we started looking at this in the first phase of RISE, like what are we going to do if something happens? And we were lucky in the Sahel in the sense that we didn't have a big concurrent or big drought shock that was hitting a lot of places at one time. There are always shocks in the Sahel. You saw the 96%. But what we didn't have is a big drought shock the way that we've had in Kenya and Ethiopia in recent years. So we said, well, we want to think ahead about this. And so we did research. We commissioned a couple of experts in the field to come out and look at this. One of them is John Anderson, who many of you know has been in this kind of field and realm for a long time. And we tried to put this into place in kind of the end of a project cycle, and it just didn't work the way we wanted it to. So we made a lot of adjustments as we were looking towards our next phase of programming. So one is we're requiring contingency planning, and in some cases we're providing crisis modifiers that go with that contingency planning. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We are putting a lot in there in geographic flexibility. We don't know from a security perspective, honestly, if we'll be able to work in the same communes 5 years from now that we're in now. We have a big amount of programming in the Centre-Nord region of Burkina Faso. If any of you have been following events in Burkina Faso, there are hundreds of thousands of IDPs in Burkina Faso that weren't there 2 years ago, and host communities are feeling the brunt of those people coming in, as well as communities that we might work with. There's displacement, and there's a lot of VEO activity, so it requires us to really be on our toes, both USAID and partners, and there's been a lot of dialogue on that. The other thing we put in here is a 6-month refine period to allow partners to hit the ground and understand what the operating environment is, who else is there, what are they doing, so that you don't write your work plan in the absence of all of that. And then common resources, templates, et cetera. We're working on that too. I think Preg probably has some really nice examples of this as well. I'm hoping, yeah. So I wanted to just share some kind of specific procurement language for you, just to show you kind of how we're actually putting this into practice and things that you would read, like evaluation criteria. Here is an evaluation criteria. This is for, I think this is actually live right now. I found it on grants.gov yesterday for our markets and nutrition activity in Niger. I wouldn't put up anything here that's procurement sensitive. This is all out there. So it talks a little bit about kind of what we're doing, and then it talks about specifically your ability to have an effective strategy in an insecure zone. So these are the kind of things that we are asking for. That doesn't mean it's easy to do it, but we're asking for them. This is another example from our Development Food Security Draft RFA for Mali. This is also up on grants.gov, and some of the flexibility that we're looking for there for a long-term food security project. So you'll see scenario planning, activity responses to anticipated shocks and changes in all of these different contexts, because this program is going to be working in parts of Mali that nobody knows what's going to happen in the next couple of years there. Specifically, going back to our RISE portfolio in Niger and Burkina, this is something that we're asking partners to do with new awards, is to be able to talk to us about what are the set of shocks that are anticipated and likely to undermine what it is we're trying to achieve, and set some thresholds around that, and then define clear roles and responsibilities. I can tell you I've been working on this summer with one of our new partners. It is not easy. It is not easy. It sounds great in theory. It's hard to do in practice, but it's something that's important in these environments. And one of the things we're trying to figure out is kind of what is that continuum? What would we do no matter what happens? It's kind of a no regrets kind of thing versus what might we shift into if conditions were to change. What would cause us to change that? Who else do we need to be talking to? These are complicated things, and they're hard to answer kind of early in a project cycle. So again, the more you know going into your proposal and the more you can say about that, kind of the more at ease that could put USAID. Talk a little bit about kind of some other things. This is a new award we have called Water Security and Resilience, which is really focused on water management, land, wash, as well as kind of risk reduction and risk management. And so there's some language in here. I won't bother you with all of it, just to say this is a $30-odd million award with a $7 million crisis modifier in it, because that is the type of environment we are working in there. And it's designed so that you write your contingency plan, and then once that contingency plan is approved, then those actions are pre-approved, and you can go forth and do. And then if there's something that falls outside of the scope of that, there's something that's set aside in there as well in terms of language that allows the partner to put in another request for kind of to use that crisis modifier. This is all kind of an experiment, and it's I don't know if it's unique. USAID has definitely used crisis modifiers before. They're often funded by OFTA. I know in Ethiopia we've used them extensively. The PRIME project that I mentioned in southern and eastern Ethiopia used crisis modifiers many times in 15 and 16, often for commercial livestock destocking. They would pay commercial partners to basically go in and buy livestock before they were worthless and kind of keep people afloat that way. So there's a lot of different ways that this has been tried. There's probably other examples that I'm not aware of. And so one of the things I do want to hear a little bit from kind of all of you is, one of the things that I've known from kind of working with partners for many years is I don't sit in the stream of RFAs and RFPs. I know the ones that I'm working on, and sometimes ones that are kind of a cote to those, but I'm not sitting there looking at RFAs and RFPs. And not all of you are, but a lot of you are, and a lot of you see kind of what comes across your desks from different missions in a way that aid staff actually don't. So if you have thoughts on what you've seen in terms of trends or what people are asking for beyond kind of this relatively small realm that I happen to be familiar with, that actually would be quite helpful. Because oftentimes you guys will come up to me and say, did you see this RFA? And I'll say, no, I didn't. But you'll tell me something about it, which is interesting from the insight. And then there's people kind of innovating all over. And we may not always know what each other's up to, but it's helpful sometimes for partners to kind of feed that information to us too. Because AID's a big animal, and we don't always know what every other piece is doing. So there's a public link to the document if you want to take a look at it. We have our regular set of resilience resources. We have a resilience links website, which will come up as kind of a complement to climate links, and we'll have a kind of a similar format and things of that nature. But I wanted to stop there. This is a dialogue, so I definitely wanted to take some questions and kind of see what you guys want to talk about and any feedback for us. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Andre. So we'll open up the floor to questions, and if you can hold hold the mic, I'll pass it around and just say where you are, your name and where you're from, and ask away.
Hi, Karen Fox with Tango International, and thank you. That was really interesting and very much aligned with a couple of the studies that we're working on right now, including one with you, Chris, on looking at the intersection of climate change adaptation and resilience and food security, as well as a PRAG partnership study. So that approach that you laid out is really, it certainly resonates. But I had a specific question. You alluded to how challenging it is to move these resources quickly, and then presented kind of this list of mechanisms whereby that might happen. So I'm just curious as to what some of those reasons are and where you're seeing strategies work. So you mentioned the delay in Ethiopia, but then also referred to the crisis modifier that was built in to the prime and grad projects there, where they were moving resources to respond. And again, what we're finding in the data, how that's a really significant component, is having that layered humanitarian assistance in the development programming.
Yeah, that's a good question. So you kind of, what are some of those barriers? I mean, some of the barriers are, it's kind of the barriers that you would think of. I mean, no one's quite sure what exactly it is you need approval for. You got to sit there and determine whether the change you want to make is within scope or not, and whether you need to go to your COR, and then whether your COR or AOR needs to go to the AO, whether you need to think about a modification in that award, or whether it's something that doesn't have that problem. Sometimes if you want to change things, as people are familiar with, you're going to run into competition problems, because you're going to be at the end of an award, or you're going to be looking at ceiling issues, or again at scope issues. Usually it's a money or it's a scope issue, and we tend to recompete our things every few years, and so if you're not going to recompete something every few years, then you got to have a good justification for that, and all of that can kind of take time. I think part of it too is that this isn't usually the way we do business, and it's really tough when you're thinking about, okay, I got this program, I got this activity, this award, and I'm really trying to accomplish these things. That's what's in my contract, or that's what the cooperative agreement says, and now you want me to do this other thing? That's not really what I was brought in to do. And now you're telling me I might not meet my targets? What if I have targets that determine how much I get paid on this award? Which happens. We see those sometimes, these incentive targets, or you get some portion of the fixed fee if you do this or that or the other thing. So those kind of things all kind of become, they can definitely be an issue. I think the way that we've seen this, or the way that we're trying to kind of work around some of these issues, is again with things like the geographic flexibility. If it says up front, we think you're going to work here, but we reserve the right for you to work in these other places too, and change that. It's tough it's tougher to kind of scope that, and it's tougher from a budget perspective. But at the same time, if for some reason we need to change, we all agree we need to move, we can do it. And we don't have to think about rewriting the contract or getting a modification. It's already there. And it's the same with kind of these contingency plans, some of these other things, trying to build in this flexibility for what we can anticipate, and then trying to do our best for some of the things we can't anticipate. I will say there's a lot that we can do within what's available to us, and that's really what this guidance talks about, is like, hey, aid staff, you don't always have to do CPFF contract, or you don't always have to do your standard cooperative agreement. There are other ways to skin a cat. It's not to say those are good or bad ways, but there are other ways to do things, right? And you could do an IDIQ where you leave one award you have a main award, and then you have an award at the side if something bad happens. There are other ways to think about this. What it doesn't take the place of is kind of some fundamental changes in how USAID does procurement. And there's, as I mentioned, there's kind of a long-term procurement reform process, effective partnering and procurement reform that's going on, and I hope that it leads to some changes and some things that are beyond my control. This is about doing the best we can within the tools that are already available to us.
Chris Perrine, Chemonics Atlas. So Andre, you pointed out, I mean, we're talking about shock response, but ultimately, I think as development practitioners, we'd like to the extent possible, avoid shocks, or at least deep shocks, by getting things right at the front end and having the flexibility midstream to make adjustments. So in terms of like getting the framing right, you mentioned some of the things that, kind of get in the way of that, different procurement instruments being on different time schedules, partners with different objectives that may not necessarily be mutually reinforcing, despite the fact that they're being asked to work together, these sorts of things. But one of the other things is getting the analysis right during design, and you mentioned that one example of two objectives that, one said we don't expect a drought, the other says we do. When we look at resilience, it seems like there are some obvious areas where risks should be assessed at the front end. I don't know if at this point if there's kind of a standard basket. I mean, we in the climate space know obviously about the CRM process, the climate risk management process, and doing climate risk and vulnerability assessments at the front end to understand those risks. And we know about political economy assessment, et cetera. But I don't know if you want to speak to that at all, about like what are kind of the basket of assessments that ought to be done to get the framework right.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. You're absolutely right. And, in the climate space, we've spent years kind of developing a tool of assessments. And, we required vulnerability assessments. That was one of the things that was required under the adaptation funding. We've done a lot of it. We have a lot of kind of required assessments in other sectors, all of which can kind of contribute to this. I think it's an area where we haven't been as strong, to be quite honest. We do have some tools that have been developed under the REAL project, and Tom and Karen are here and can talk more to that. We have a risk and resilience analysis assessment tool that's been developed with Mercy Corps, who's done a lot of work on this themselves. All of this is kind of free information, free resources. There's a whole set of free resources on kind of how to do analysis and M&E around resilience, but it is an evolving field, and it's not one where we have the same kind of protocols and kind of ways of doing things that we do in other fields, in the way that we've had to kind of build it with adaptation. And it's an area where we're just not quite as strong. So yeah, it's a good point to bring up. I think the other question with analysis too is trying to figure out the right balance between doing analysis, kind of enough analysis to inform a procurement decision, but not doing so much analysis that we spend 2 years doing a procurement. And then, so we also spend a lot of time doing analysis that we never share. Aid spends hundreds of thousands of dollars doing internal analysis that often is not shared with the bidders and the ultimate partner. Gender analysis, sustainability, there's a lot of it. Some of it is shared, but not all of it is, and it's a problem. So I think that's another way where we want to be more open. When we did the RISE 2 design, you can go to the website. There are 6 or 7 different analyses: a midterm performance assessment, youth analysis, gender. All of it's there, and all of it says in the RFAs and RFPs, it is here. Go use it. It's public good for everybody who's interested in working in this space. So that is one way that we've kind of tried to get around that. But it's both an issue in resilience, but it's a macro issue, I think, across aid in terms of that. But one of the things that we'd like to do, I think, a little bit more of is definitely more kind of applied research or applied analysis with partners to understand, so that, when you guys get on the ground, you have that analysis that informs the procurements and all of that. But also when you get on the ground, you're doing analysis that's really going to inform what you're actually going to do, because sometimes that analysis is very macro, so it's not as helpful as we'd like it to be. Tom, you want to add to that?
I'm Tom Spangler. I'm with Save the Children, and as Andre mentioned, I have a role in what's known as the REAL Award. It's the Resilience Evaluation, Analysis, and Learning Award with the center, of course, but also with Mercy Corps, Tango, and Food for the Hungry. So yes, just to follow up, we have made great progress in refining and getting more consistency in terms of approaches to resilience evaluation and analysis, and those tools are all available. Most specifically, the resilience capacities and resilience measurement options, which are really quite detailed. There's a full set not only of the questionnaires themselves, but analysis and numerator guidance on that. Those are important because they've served as a basis for resilience analysis as part of Food for Peace and Feed the Future baseline and inline impact evaluations. And so I think it does lend itself to getting some consistency that we are measuring those shocks and stresses, we are measuring the responses to those and the well-being outcomes in a uniform way that speaks to your point, Andre, of really looking at not at how many trainings you hold or what the outputs are or whatever, not just numbers, but what are the trends in terms of these priority areas and these changes in resilience capacities. Also, as you said, Mercy Corps has developed something that's very complementary, not from necessarily an evaluation perspective, but more from a program design perspective, the strategic resilience assessment approach that they have. And there's a number of guidance documents that are, I think, very accessible and very immediately practical for implementers. And then, Andre, you kind of set up, I guess, a question I had for you and the rest of the group. I think what is interesting to me is trying to kind of bring our communities together in a way, like in terms of AID and implementers, because a very interesting concrete point that came out of a workshop that we held in Uganda in May that was based on resilience analysis in 6 different countries of the Horn, really drawing on this methodology for resilience analysis. And the title of the workshop was Application of Evidence for Decision Making. Well, what became crystal clear there, and we had USAID representatives and implementing partners and regional government representatives there, is that there are a huge range of different decisions that need to be made, and these evaluation tools are not ideally suited for each and every type of decision, such that that impact evaluation that had been done in the Horn was very useful, I think, for our mission counterparts there, but what we heard from implementers is we can't use these for the type of decisions that we need to make to adaptively manage at the program level, right? So I think there's a lot of work to be done there also, and hopefully we can do it in line with some of the adaptive management that USAID is focusing on.
Can I just add to that? Yeah, the REAL award, and also there's another mechanism, the IDEAL award. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's an implementer-led kind of capacity strengthening and knowledge management award, also based at SAVE, but among a consortium of partners. So it's just, I mentioned that because these 2 awards, the REAL and IDEAL, sort of dovetail a bit, and one of the main work streams within IDEAL is to sort of build on this analysis and evidence gathering over the last 5 years and focus on adaptive management and resilience monitoring to respond to what we're hearing from so many corners about the need to have lighter, flexible tools that can help us understand what's happening at the systems level and link that with well-being at household and community levels. So I just wanted to mention as well that one of the tools that's been developed as a result of all of this analysis effort is this recurrent monitoring survey approach, where there's a short survey, a short qualitative exercise that's linked to a baseline or linked to the baseline essentially. So it doesn't require, you don't sample your entire population, and it doesn't require a long, extensive survey because you've already collected all that demographic information. So every 2 to every 6 months, depending upon how it's built into the program, and it's been 7 different countries, I think, so far, 7 at least.
All right.
Yeah, I'm rolling it out now in Kenya. But it's a way that the idea, and in I guess it's Care, Shahardo, Bangladesh, they're actually using it as a monitoring tool to get kind of resilience-oriented information back into programming within 2 or 3 weeks. And there's a webinar coming up on the 29th of this month that will focus on that through the REAL website, I think. So anyway.
Yeah, thanks,
Good
Tom
question.
and Karen, for bringing that up. And there is a whole body of work, and I think we're heading into year 4 of the REAL award, and we've got a lot of stuff that's up on our website, and there's a lot of brilliant thinking that went into it, and part of what we need to do is push it out to all of you so everyone's aware of what's in there and what it can do, and to get people interested in that and get using those tools. I think also we've learned a lot under Atlas. There's been a lot of stuff that's been done specifically looking at climate and health risks, I think, under Atlas. That was another area where we didn't know a whole lot about when we started. and it's an area that we know a whole lot more about now. And so as we're looking at the broader set of risks, that's great, but we also have some tools that we have developed and approaches and knowledge that we've developed over the last couple of years, which looks more specifically at some issues that are really germane to some of the places that we're working in. And one of the things that didn't really pop up in here is health and health risks. And one of the things that we've seen, I didn't highlight the research that we've done on sustainable poverty escapes, but one of the things that we see looking at households over time and kind of who escapes poverty and who doesn't is these shocks and stresses, especially the shocks, can really kind of take people down off a trajectory of climbing out of poverty. And we have some people that climb out of poverty only to fall back into poverty. Some people never really get out of poverty. And health can play a huge role in that, and people's ability to stay healthy, people's ability to avoid kind of unexpected costs or somebody not being able to work or things along those lines. So in some of the countries that we're working in, we're thinking much more about that kind of comprehensively. We have a big health component of health system strengthening as part of our RISE program because health is an important element of it. As you know, that health is its own thing in USAID world, and I take a lot of inspiration from the work that the adaptation community has done over the years to really kind of work with health and find a way that we can talk in a way that's mutually beneficial, and we have information that's really hopefully pushing them to think a little bit more about their decisions.
Hi, Caitlin Cornadolph, USDA. So one of my questions was about your point on partnerships. I was wondering if you had conversations with other donors about using similar mechanisms to facilitate kind of everyone coming together. I was recently at a conference where someone came up to me and said that they appreciated what USAID was doing and would really like for that conversation to be kind of spread to allow them to be more mobile.
The short answer is we have done some of that. I'll be a little bit honest. I think we spend so much time organizing USAID that we don't always have the bandwidth to really kind of push in other environments. It also is very country specific. You have certain countries where donor groups are very strong, where the government says, hey, donor X, you're going over here, donor Y, you're going over here. You have other countries where there's no such structure. And you have some countries where you have USAID missions that really can plug into a structure that already exists, or you have someone who's designing or wants to build that structure. You have other countries where you just don't see that really. So it's a real kind of mixed bag. I will say we have had some success in, I'm thinking specifically about northern Uganda, where we have a mechanism that just ended called the Karamoja Resilient Support Unit that was co-funded by DFID, and we got some money from Irish Aid as well, that was designed to kind of host the regular donor meetings around the Karamoja region of Uganda, and also to do analysis that was used to inform donor programming, but also government programming. And that mechanism was also used to help the government complete their second phase of their development program for Karamoja. And so it was it's a very nice example of places where we have partnered with other donors, where we do definitely have mutual interest on things. But that is an ongoing discussion, and it's a little bit different in every country. And I wish in some places we had kind of more bandwidth to do more of that. But it remains a challenge. It doesn't mean it's not worth doing, but it remains a kind of a consistent perennial challenge for us.
Anyone else?
Yeah. So, I mean, just to follow up on my own question earlier, I mean, the adaptive management thing, I mean, if it is done in earnest, that becomes a way, my question earlier was about, what's kind of the assessment framework that helps you to properly frame these kinds of activities where resilience is kind of the order of the day. If you really are doing adaptive management in earnest and you really do have the flexibility to make, significant adjustments on the fly, based on new information that comes in, that is a sort of, it's a kind of a rolling assessment process in a way. And I really do hope that that is a trend that does continue in USAID and with other donors as well, obviously, because as you said quite correctly, Andre, we don't have all the answers at the front end. I mean, we're working in incredibly complex environments, and assumptions we make at the front end may turn out to be completely wrong or partially wrong, so we have to have that flexibility if we really want to make change. The other thing is longer time frames, but who knows if we can ever really get there. The way that Congress allocates money and things.
Everyone wants longer time frames until they don't hold a mechanism, and then they want it repeated, recompeted every 5 years. So, I mean, I think there are ways to kind of to manage some of these issues, but I think too, I think it's good for partners to talk to aid about some of these challenges, and if you want to do something, then let's have a conversation about it. I can tell you already we've done some iteration with some of this stuff. We've tried some of this stuff and it has not worked. One of the things we realized is that if you try and do it 4 years into a program, you will not have a lot of reception. So, by that point, everyone's just sprinting for they got their work plan, they're sprinting for the finish. And so it does require us to be very strategic when we think about kind of when we do these things and how we do these things. And it's always tricky to say to partners, you should really kind of do something that's out of the ordinary, because usually it's about kind of responding to what's very clear in that RFA and RFP. But, we do also want that thinking outside of the box. Or if you have that experience doing it in another place or in another dynamic, bringing that to the table and showing us that, you have the organizational capacity or the staffing to do that. I think one of the other challenges we've seen with staffing is, we're working in places that are very difficult. Jeff knows all about working in difficult places and trying to figure out how you're going to keep and maintain and recruit staff that you need to work in those places and are going to have the right kind of mentality and mindset to do that. And that's a very tricky thing to do too, but it's something we hope organizations are thinking about too when you're thinking about recruiting, when you're thinking about your long-term kind of talent development, how we can have those folks, because it's a benefit to all of us.
I'm sorry to grab the microphone again, but I have to follow on to your question, Chris. Yeah, just to the extent that that's such an important point and ties into what you were saying, Andre, about how important it is to program around problems rather than resource streams. And it's just something that we're, again, finding across a lot of different studies and partnership studies that are trying to do climate change adaptation and resilience programming. I had another thought, but I've already lost it.
I don't know if you wanted to address her question or not, or follow on, but Andre, you had touched upon earlier sort of climate risks and health and that particular sector. There's sort of I guess it's a mandate within AID to sort of mainstream across sectors, sort of resilience programming. And so it seems that at this point so far, a lot of the work that's been done has really been around food security in terms of sort of conceptual framing of what resilience is and measuring it and so on. Can you touch a little bit upon other sectors, other offices, and how far along they are in terms of how they are framing resilience, how they're beginning to develop tools, measuring, what kind of harmonization is taking place, or is there harmonization taking place?
Yeah, I mean, let me be a little bit clearer in terms of requirements. I mean, we have a climate risk screening requirement. That's a requirement. We have these 13 focus countries that we are working on resilience in their focus zones. There isn't really any other requirement for resilience. We hope everybody does it because we think it's a good idea. But we don't necessarily have the requirements that certain kind of other sectors have. I think you're absolutely right in the sense that, this has traditionally been seen as a food security thing. The outcome of interest has often been kind of food security or stunting or wasting or poverty or things that are traditionally associated with the food security sector. I think we're getting pushed to take a broader lens in a number of different environments, partly because the programming kind of requires it. I'm thinking about some of our stuff in Sahel where we're making some big investments in the health sector, and we have to be able to measure that. I will say that resilience is a concept that is sector agnostic, and it's about building those capacities to do whatever development outcome you want to achieve, and that could be in any sector. So, and I'm hoping that with the creation of the new Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, we'll be able to kind of push these things out a little bit wider. It's always good to have examples from programming, and so I think that's part of what we're doing in certain places. But I know certainly we have evolved in how we're looking at integrating certain programming types. And every funding stream still needs to deliver on its own mandate, and that is the way it is. And we have excellent technical expertise in those funding streams, but I think we're also looking for ways to have it really think about how it's building that set of capacities. And I think we have some really nice findings now from Kenya and Ethiopia talking about which capacities are really important. And that leads us to think a little bit more, okay, well, if that's what's really important, what types of investments do we need? What types of programs do we need? And being able to kind of put that together in a little bit more of a comprehensive package and seeing, I know the term I like to use is portfolio. We have a portfolio of investments, not just this thing over here or that thing over there. But as many of you know, that's not traditionally the way aid has thought in many places, so that's a little bit of an uphill struggle. But it's one we're working on.
Great. Okay. Our speaker has to run a little bit early, so I think this is a great place to wrap things up. Again, thank you, Andre, for the presentation today.
Absolutely.
And, the slides as well as the recorded webinar will be available on Climate Links coming soon. So again, thank you all for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks.